Welcome back to another episode of Foresight by Groundline USA. We're joined again by Groundline USA President Christian Nolden. Christian, good to see you again. Glad you're here.
Thanks, Trip. Thanks for having me. I really enjoy doing these, so I appreciate another opportunity to do it.
Absolutely. Well, I want to kind of center our conversation today around utility resiliency because it seems like everywhere we look, there's a test of a utility's resiliency, and it's such a broad topic. Maybe maybe kick things off for us and explain a little bit about some of the more common threats to utility resiliency today.
That's a great question, Trip. It's something that we've thought a lot about. We've released a white paper on resiliency versus reliability. We talked a little bit about resiliency on our last podcast. And I think, there's been a lot of discussion about a lot of the common threats, aging infrastructure, climate change, cybersecurity, workforce and skills. All of these issues are things that I think we've all heard and talked about very, very extensively. I think what I'd like to do is just take a half step back and say, well, what does all this mean? And I think to me, what's important for us to understand is that it's the base assumptions that utilities have been working with that are changing. That's the biggest threat, I think, to resiliency. So a utility has a workflow with their people and processes based on how long assets age from their experience, how is load flow changing based on their experience, what is happening with weather and storms, how frequent are the failures, what happens when you respond, who's responsible for what. There are a lot of assumptions behind how all those pieces fit together, and they're all changing at a level that hasn't been seen before. If I think about workforce and skills, we've talked a little bit about how people are leaving because they're aging out, or the people coming in don't necessarily have the experience. I think we get that. But what does that actually mean? What do those people that are aging and leaving the utility actually have? What decisions are they making that are not able to be made once they're gone? How do I store that knowledge? And what do I do to get the new people up to speed? Those specific questions within that, I think, are things that we should dive a bit deeper into. When it comes to cybersecurity. We talked a lot about that as an industry. When I think about it, one of the things that I think is an issue is what about the supply chain? I'm in the supply chain now as a vendor, so I think about that quite a lot. What are the issues that we're not necessarily considering? For an example, from me, I sell, one of the things I sell is an asset monitoring device, right? So what I think about is what types of software are utilities becoming more and more dependent on to make their decisions? They're trying to monitor condition in real time. They're trying to use analytics to make more decisions. That's great. But what about malicious code that's coming in from a supplier into that? And how does that affect the decisions you're trying to make? So those are things that we never really had to assume or think about before because the information was stored in a static location or with somebody's files or notes that has been with the utility for a number of years who can make decisions on the fly. So those are things that I think we're not really considering what are the impacts in how we're taking some of these items as they come to us. So I think too, probably the last piece I wanted to get into on that is asset degradation. So we know assets are aging, right? Well, most of the assets, I'm a power lines guy, so most of the assets degrade in a way where the issue is hidden. You might be able to see surface rust and you might be able to see some kind of rot from the outside. But if I think about conductors, those generally degrade from the inside out. So it's not until the very end that you're able to see an issue. So how are we dealing with that specific aspect of the aging infrastructure issue? If you monitor those in real time, you may get a little bit ahead of when they fail, but you're still not getting the degradation well before that. So I feel that that's important. Wood poles is the subject near and dear to my heart. How far in advance of that wood pole failure are you looking at what's happening inside that pole? And so I think those are interesting ways to consider the threats for reliability and definitely with resiliency.
Well, that kind of leads into where I was going, and that's As we know, and you've alluded to this even on some of our past episodes, utilities aren't completely defenseless in this arena. So, what are some of the emerging technologies that utilities are adopting to increase their resiliency?
Yeah, I think that that's something, again, near and dear to my heart as a technology solutions provider. I think what I often talk to people about is the fact that a lot of these technologies that are emerging really aren't emerging. I think that's very important mentally to ingest and adapt to, because if I consider a technology as emerging, I have two things I need to evaluate. I need to evaluate the validity of the technology, and then I need to evaluate how to implement the technology. Those are two steps. And I think a lot of the technology that's out there, whether it's automated metering, whether it's real-time monitoring of condition, whether it's new cybersecurity solutions, whether it's distributed energy, a lot of these technologies are not actually as emerging as we think about them. Not to say that you as a utility had not have adopted this before and so you have a lot of experience. It may be new to you, but I think if you at least take a little bit of a mental shift and say, well, they're not necessarily emerging. So the core technological concepts work. It's now about how do I integrate those into my business? What it does is it shortens the time frame for you to bring it in sometimes, and it also shifts the focus of how you're doing it. You're working on how to make it work as opposed to putting it into a category of the business that's sole purpose is to say yes or no, in or out of our business. And I think if you feel that the technology is suitable for your needs and you are motivated to implement it, you'll work out the solutions as you implement it, which is how we've done most everything in a successful way in many industries. It's just the utility a lot of times gets stuck in pilot cycles where they evaluate it in one pilot and then user requirements change. And so you need to go into another pilot and then you go into another pilot. And at the end of the day, you're not really much further to implementing it because you don't know what the trigger is to bring it into the business. And so I feel that if you think about emerging technologies in that way, it's really quite useful. But I feel that software analytics is starting to feel a bit more emerging, and specifically AI, machine learning, and those impacts on businesses are definitely something that are emerging right in front of us. And we're all trying to figure out how to fit it in. Me and my business, I'm trying to figure it out. Do I use Copilot to help me draft emails? Do I help it to do marketing for me? Do I help it to do analysis for me? Does it write code? What does this do and how do I use it? That's definitely something that's, I'd say, very confronting because the use cases for AI and machine learning are endless. The applications could be in every facet of the business, but trying to figure that out in a way when you're dealing with everything else is a very big challenge.
Absolutely. AI is that buzzword that's in front of everybody at this point. That's an interesting take that, you know, not every technology is an emerging technology still. They've gotten past that initial viability stage and now it's apply it, find some way to apply it. So I guess to tie all of it back in together, how do utilities balance the cost of upgrading infrastructure with the need for resiliency? So how do they combine the two together, or weigh those things appropriately?
I think that from my perspective, it's more important to do a bit of both. I don't know if you need to really think through how to balance it as much as make sure that whatever you're doing in one area is utilizable in the other area. If I'm trying to upgrade a whole bunch of infrastructure within my network, well, one of the key activities I'm going to need to do is collect data on what I need to upgrade. Okay, so I need to know what pieces of data that I'm going to collect. I need to know where I'm going to store it, and I need to know how I get that data. And so I think if you think through those things holistically and say, right, I'm going to need to solve future problems, and I'm going to need to do those same things, make sure that those data related activities are documented, consistent, cost effective so that you can utilize it for resiliency. Better yet, make sure you're collecting that data in a way and storing it in a way that it's there for the future. So if I am getting ready to assess, I've got a massive program to replace foundations. Great. Well, I need to understand What are the issues with the foundations? I need to go out and collect data on those, and I need to go ahead and store those. So go ahead and do that in a way where it's not on paper checklists. It's not just related to a project. It's not just with a contractor. And make sure that you're able to collect data in a way that's allowing you to make judgments about degradation and helping to start the future prediction trends. Likewise, if you're taking care of a resiliency issue, you want to make sure that those decisions you're making are also going to be able to help you deal with today's issues. So you're not just collecting things that are only going to be useful in 5 or 10 years' time. It should all tell the same story. Asset upgrades, asset replacements are just the point in time right now of the resiliency degradation sort of trend. So make sure that you're trying to be as common as possible. I like to focus on the data side and the asset condition side. So make sure that those practices are things that you can extend into other areas and do it fairly quickly so you could start to collect the information needed to make resiliency decisions. And I think cost effectiveness behind all of that is really important. As you start to evaluate some of the things that are helping you make asset decisions, you should be thinking through, okay, is this something I can repeat? No, why not? And if not, is there something else that can get me some of this information in a cost effective way? So for me, I like to close with a thought about measuring things because measuring things is a critical part of understanding what's needing to be replaced, upgraded, maintained, what's needing to be uh, addressed in the future if it's degrading. And the definition of measurement is not necessarily getting an object or a thing into a known state. Measurement is really about reducing uncertainty about something through observation. And so if I take that philosophy and I approach my assets like that, I can learn a lot about assets with very few measurements because if I don't know much about them, I take a few measurements, I've learned a lot more about them than I knew. So what's an approach you can take that's cost effective to do that? So for example, do I send a two-man crew out and do a whole really detailed inspection of every single asset? How long is that going to take? How much is that going to cost? Or do I take a drone or some other aerial platform and go across the whole network really quickly and collect one picture per pole and learn something about every one of my assets? Those are the sort of trade-offs that I think are quite different now with the technologies that are out there and the cost pressures we've got on us. And so if you feel through some of these things, you can say, right, I need a certain amount of information to address the here and now, and I need something to start me down the path of becoming more resilient. And if I think about the asset challenge, that's one way you can do it.
Absolutely. So definitely a lot of elements to keep in mind, but kind of the big picture, make sure you're doing what's going to be important down the road, but also don't neglect the here and now for it, and don't fall into that paralysis by analysis trap, right? Do something, start down
Yeah.
the path at some point. That'll do it for this episode. So thank you again for taking time out of your day to share those insights and offer up that wisdom again, and just continuing to make this podcast such a valuable asset for the industry.
I really appreciate it, Trip, and I think that the utilities are doing great things for the public, for you and I, and they just need to understand they have a big job and they're doing the best they can. So anything people can do to support them, I think it's on us in the industry to try to help them out so that they can continue to do something that's critical for all of us now and in the future. So appreciate the opportunity to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, be sure to follow Groundline USA on social media, LinkedIn in particular, to stay up to date on all the latest news and podcast episodes. We'll see you next time.